In a small quiet village nestled in the countryside, 5 orphans lived in a run-down barn that was barely standing. The barn had once been a place of life and laughter, but now it was dark, cold, and filled with sadness. These children had lost everything. Both of their parents had died in an accident, and the only person left to care for them was a frail, elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson. She was kind-hearted but had no strength or resources to properly take care of 5 growing children. The barn, though large, was falling apart. The roof leaked whenever it rained, and the walls creaked as if the whole structure was barely holding itself together. There were no windows, only small holes in the walls that let in the light during the day. The children, despite their hardships, tried to make the best of their situation. They spent their days huddled together for warmth, playing simple games like hopscotch in the dirt, or reading stories they had heard from their parents when they were younger. Their lives were filled with dreams of a better future, even though they had little to hope for. The children were different ages, ranging from little Emma, who was just 6 years old, to the oldest, John, who was 14. John tried to act like a father figure to his younger siblings, often taking on the responsibility of gathering firewood to keep them warm and making sure they had enough food, but it was never enough. Mrs. Thompson did what she could, but her age and illness made it difficult for her to care for the children in a way that could give them any kind of future. Their situation grew worse with each passing month. The villagers knew about the orphans and the situation they were in, but most of them turned a blind eye. The village was poor, and many families had their own struggles. There was no one who had the means or the desire to step in and help. The children were simply forgotten by most, and as the years went by, their chances of a better life seemed slimmer and slimmer. Then one day, a wealthy merchant from the neighboring town named Mr. Walker came to the village. He was known for his hard deals and cold demeanor. He was in search of land to buy and had heard about the dilapidated barn that belonged to Mrs. Thompson. After a brief conversation, he struck a deal with her. He would buy the barn and the land it sat on, and in return he would give Mrs. Thompson a small sum of money which she desperately needed. But there was a catch. Mr. Walker made it clear that the children would be part of the sale. They were no longer considered part of Mrs. Thompson's responsibility. He had no interest in taking care of them, and in his eyes they were simply a burden. He saw them as little more than workers who could be sold off to labor camps or taken in by families in need of cheap help. The news spread quickly, and the children began to understand the reality of their situation. The older ones, especially John, tried to keep the younger ones calm, but fear was spreading through their hearts. They had heard of how children like them were sold into harsh, labor-filled lives, forced to work for cruel masters. The thought of being separated and sent to different places was more than they could bear. They held on to each other, clinging to the little comfort they had left. But they knew deep down that their time together as a family might soon be over. For days, the children waited, dreading the moment when they would have to leave the barn that had been their home. They could see the merchant preparing the paperwork ready to finalize the deal. Mrs. Thompson, who was still trying to manage everything on her own, seemed helpless to do anything about it. She had no way to stop the transaction, and it was clear that she would never be able to provide a better life for the children. The orphans were trapped in a world where no one seemed to care about them. John, feeling a deep sense of responsibility, took one last walk through the barn. The walls, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt cold and empty. The air was damp and the smell of mildew filled his nose. He could hear his younger siblings playing in the corner, their innocent laughter a painful reminder of the joy they had lost. He tried to push away the tears that threatened to fall, knowing that he needed to be strong for them. But deep down he was scared. What would happen to them once they were sold? Would they ever see each other again? The uncertainty was unbearable. As the days grew shorter, the children could feel the weight of their fate pressing down on them. They no longer played games or told stories. Instead, they spent their time in silence, trying to prepare themselves for what was to come. It was as if their entire world had been reduced to the barn and the cruel reality that awaited them outside. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, a stranger appeared at the barn's entrance. The children were startled, and John quickly stood in front of his siblings to protect them. But the stranger didn't seem threatening. He was a kind-looking man, dressed in simple but well-maintained clothes. His eyes were warm and there was a gentle smile on his face. "I've heard about you all," the man said softly. "My name is Thomas. I've come to see if I can help." At first, the children didn't know how to respond. They had grown so used to being ignored or treated as a burden that they couldn't believe anyone would come to their aid. But something about Thomas's presence made them feel a glimmer of hope, something they hadn't felt in a long time. As Thomas spoke to them, he explained that he had heard about their plight from a few villagers. He had come to see if there was any way he could help them before they were sold off. The children listened intently, their hearts racing with a mixture of fear and hope. Could someone actually save them? Could they escape the fate that seemed inevitable? Thomas didn't make any promises, but he spoke with such sincerity that the children began to believe in the possibility of a different life. Little did they know that Thomas was not just a kind stranger, but someone who would soon change the course of their lives forever. His visit sparked a chain of events that would eventually lead to their rescue. But at that moment, all the children could do was hold on to the faint hope that things might finally get better. The barn, which had been a symbol of despair, suddenly seemed to hold a faint glimmer of possibility. The children didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time in a long while they felt that maybe, just maybe, their story hadn't been written yet. Thomas and his wife Sarah lived in a peaceful town a few hours away from the village where the 5 orphans lived. Their home was warm and welcoming, filled with the sounds of laughter and the warmth of love. But there was a sadness that lingered in the hearts of Sarah and Thomas. They had been married for many years, but despite their best efforts, they had not been able to have children. They had tried everything, visiting doctors, trying treatments, and hoping with all their hearts that one day they would be blessed with a child. But year after year, their dream of becoming parents had not come true. The couple's love for children was undeniable. They would often visit the local orphanage, bringing small gifts, toys, or treats to the children there. It was the closest they could come to having a family of their own. But it wasn't the same. They longed to have a child of their own to care for, to raise, to love as their own. As time passed, their hope of ever having a child began to fade. Yet their desire for a family remained as strong as ever. One day, while Sarah was at the market, she overheard a conversation between 2 villagers about 5 orphaned children living in a barn on the edge of a nearby village. The conversation spoke of the sad fate these children faced, about how they would soon be sold off with the barn as part of a deal. Sarah's heart broke when she heard these words. She couldn't imagine what those children must be going through, how scared and alone they must feel, knowing that their entire world could be torn apart at any moment. Sarah couldn't shake the thought of the orphans from her mind. She rushed home that afternoon and immediately told Thomas about what she had heard. They both knew that something had to be done. The thought of children, especially so many young ones, being sold like property was too much to bear. Sarah and Thomas, who had always wanted to make a difference in the world, felt that this could be their chance to do something meaningful, something that would change their lives and the lives of these children forever. Without hesitation, they decided that they would find a way to help. They weren't sure how, but they knew they had to act. They spent the following days planning their trip to the village, trying to figure out how they could intervene and save the children from being sold. Sarah, with her natural kindness and nurturing spirit, was determined to give these children the love and care they had been deprived of. Thomas, on the other hand, was more practical. He knew that saving the children wasn't going to be easy. There were legal matters to consider, and they didn't have nearly enough money to buy the barn and the children, especially not from a businessman like Mr. Walker. But neither Sarah nor Thomas was willing to let this stop them. They both felt in their hearts that these children deserved a chance, that they deserved a home, love, and a future. Sarah dreamed of becoming a mother to these children, and Thomas dreamed of raising them in a home filled with warmth and security. For the first time in years, they felt a sense of hope stirring within them. The journey to the village was long and exhausting. The roads were rough and the weather was unpredictable, but Sarah and Thomas were determined. When they finally arrived in the village, they were shocked to see how run down the area looked. The homes were small and worn, and the air seemed thick with a sense of despair. The village had been struggling for years, and the people here were no strangers to hardship. It wasn't difficult to find the barn where the orphans lived. The dilapidated structure was impossible to miss. They made their way through the village and approached the barn, their hearts heavy with the weight of what they were about to see. When they arrived, Sarah's eyes immediately found the children. They were sitting on the dirt floor, looking thin and dirty, their clothes ragged and torn. They looked up with curiosity as Sarah and Thomas approached, unsure of who these strangers were. "Hello," Sarah said gently, her voice soft and warm. "We've heard about you and we've come to help." The children were hesitant at first. They had learned to be cautious of strangers, especially ones who seemed too kind or too eager to help. They had seen too many people come and go, making promises they never kept. But there was something in Sarah's voice, something in the way she looked at them that made them feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, these strangers could be different. Thomas stepped forward and introduced himself, explaining that they had heard about their situation and wanted to find a way to help. "We don't want you to be sold off," Thomas said, his voice filled with determination. "We want to give you a better life, a real home, a family." For a few moments there was silence. The children exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of what to believe. They had heard so many empty promises in the past, and the idea of trusting strangers was a difficult one. But Sarah and Thomas's sincerity shone through. The couple wasn't just talking about giving them food or shelter. They were offering something much more valuable: love and a future. Little Emma, the youngest, was the first to speak. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Will you really take care of us?" she asked, her wide eyes searching Sarah's face for any sign of deception. Sarah knelt down to Emma's level and smiled softly. "We promise," she said, her voice filled with warmth and reassurance. "We want to take care of you. We want to be your family." The other children, still unsure, looked at each other. Emma's simple question had opened the door to something they hadn't dared to dream of: a chance at a different life, a life filled with love and care. Thomas and Sarah spoke to them for a while longer, telling them about their home, their plans, and the kind of life they wanted to offer. They promised that they would do everything in their power to make sure the children would never have to suffer again. The children listened carefully, their hearts slowly starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. After a long conversation, Sarah and Thomas left the barn with a heavy heart, knowing that there was still much to be done. They had made a connection with the children, but they knew that getting them out of their situation wouldn't be easy. The merchant, Mr. Walker, had made it clear that he would not let the children go easily. The couple was determined to fight for them, but they also knew that they didn't have much time. The next day, Sarah and Thomas made their way to see Mr. Walker, hoping they could make some sort of deal. As they walked through the village streets, Sarah couldn't help but think about the children they had met. She thought about Emma's innocent face, the fear in her eyes, and the way the other children had looked to her for answers. Sarah and Thomas were the children's last hope. They couldn't afford to fail. The next morning, Sarah and Thomas woke up early, their minds racing with plans for how to save the children. They knew that time was running out. If they didn't act quickly, Mr. Walker would finalize the deal and the children would be sold off as part of the barn's purchase. The couple could already feel the weight of the situation bearing down on them. They needed a way to get the children out of that barn and into a safe, loving home before it was too late. Sarah and Thomas decided that their first step was to speak with Mr. Walker directly. They had heard that he was a businessman who cared only for money and profits, but they hoped that their compassion and determination might change his mind. They had to try. When they arrived at the merchant's home, they were surprised by the coldness of his mansion. It was large, with tall stone walls, and everything about it seemed imposing. There were no signs of warmth or kindness here, just the sharp, cold walls that mirrored the man they were about to meet. They entered his office, a grand room filled with expensive furniture and piles of paperwork. Mr. Walker sat behind a large oak desk, looking up at them with a bored expression. "Mr. Walker," Thomas began, "we came to discuss the children living in the barn. We understand that you've bought the land, but we hope there's a way we can work something out." Mr. Walker didn't look up from his papers. "There's nothing to discuss," he said flatly. "I've bought the barn and with it the children. They will be sold off as part of the deal. It's simple business." Sarah's heart sank at his words, but she quickly composed herself. She could feel Thomas's grip on her hand tighten, and she knew that they both had to remain calm. "Please, Mr. Walker," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "These children have already suffered so much. We want to give them a future, a real home where they will be loved and cared for. Please don't sell them. We are willing to pay you a fair price, whatever it takes." Mr. Walker finally looked up at them, his cold eyes narrowing. "You can't afford what I'm asking for," he said, his tone sharp. "This is a business transaction, not a charity. The children are not for sale to you. You should know better than to think that I would give up a profitable deal for the sake of a few poor orphans." Thomas tried to stay calm, but his patience was running thin. "We don't care about the money. What we care about is the children. We are willing to do whatever it takes to help them. You have the power to decide their fate. Please do the right thing." Mr. Walker leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak for a long time, and for a moment Sarah and Thomas were afraid that he would simply refuse them and send them away. But then he spoke again, his voice slow and calculating. "I suppose you could raise the money. If you really want the children, I will consider it. But you'll have to come up with a substantial amount, and you'll have to do it quickly. If you can pay me in full by the end of the week, I'll release the children. If not, they're mine to do with as I please." Sarah and Thomas exchanged a look of determination. The deadline was tight, but they had no choice. This was their only chance to save the children. "We'll get the money," Thomas said firmly. "We promise you that." Mr. Walker gave a small, mocking smile. "We'll see. I'll be waiting." The couple left Mr. Walker's office with a heavy heart but a renewed sense of purpose. They knew that the next few days would be crucial. They had to come up with the money somehow, and they had very little time to do so. The only option they had was to mortgage their home. It was a big risk, but they couldn't bear the thought of the children being sold off to an uncertain and dangerous future. When they returned home, they immediately began making plans. The bank was their only hope. The couple would have to go to the local bank and borrow as much money as they could, using their home as collateral. It wasn't an easy decision to make, but they both knew it was the only way. They spent the rest of the day gathering the necessary paperwork and making arrangements to meet with the bank the next morning. The day of the meeting, Sarah and Thomas stood nervously in front of the bank manager. "Mr. Roberts." They explained their situation, telling him everything they had learned about the children and the deal with Mr. Walker. Mr. Roberts listened carefully, and when they were done, he didn't speak immediately. He looked at the couple thoughtfully, then nodded slowly. "This is a difficult decision," Mr. Roberts said. "I understand your desire to help these children, but mortgaging your home is a huge risk. If anything were to happen, you could lose everything. Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Thomas looked at Sarah, who nodded with determination. "We don't have a choice. These children need us. We can't let them suffer." Mr. Roberts paused for a moment, then sighed. "I will approve the loan, but understand that you're taking on a significant amount of debt. You'll have to pay it back, and there will be interest. But if you believe in this cause, then I'll help. I'll give you the money, but you must act quickly." Sarah and Thomas thanked Mr. Roberts profusely and left the bank with the loan in hand. It wasn't much, but it was enough to secure the children's freedom. They still had to pay Mr. Walker by the end of the week, and every moment felt like it was slipping away. But they refused to give up. They knew that they had made the right decision, no matter how hard it would be to repay the loan in the future. The next day, Sarah and Thomas returned to the village, their hearts pounding with anticipation. They had the money. They had what they needed to save the children. They walked to Mr. Walker's mansion once again, their determination stronger than ever. When Mr. Walker saw them, he raised an eyebrow in surprise. "I see you've managed to come up with the money," he said, his tone neutral. "We have," Thomas replied, pulling out the required amount in cash. "Now please release the children." Mr. Walker took the money without hesitation and handed over the necessary paperwork, his eyes cold but accepting. "The deal is done," he said. "The children are yours." As Sarah and Thomas left Mr. Walker's mansion with the papers in hand, they couldn't contain their excitement. They had done it. They had saved the children. The couple rushed back to the barn where the children were waiting. When they saw Sarah and Thomas, their faces lit up with disbelief and hope. The orphans couldn't quite understand what had happened, but they knew that things had changed. They were free. They were going to be given a chance at a new life. Sarah knelt down, smiling at the children. "We've done it," she said softly. "You're safe now. You'll never have to be sold again." Tears of joy filled the children's eyes as they rushed into Sarah and Thomas's arms. For the first time in a long while, they felt loved. They felt wanted, and in that moment everything had changed. The orphans were no longer alone in the world. They had a family now, and that family would fight for them no matter what. The days following the purchase of the orphans were some of the happiest for Sarah and Thomas. They had fought hard for the children, and now they could finally give them the safety and love they deserved. As they left Mr. Walker's mansion with the signed papers in hand, the weight of the past few days seemed to lift off their shoulders. They had done what they thought was impossible, and now the children were free. When Sarah and Thomas returned to the barn, the children were still sitting on the dirt floor, waiting anxiously. They looked up with wide eyes as the couple entered. At first, they didn't understand what had happened. It seemed almost too good to be true. But when they saw the smiles on Sarah and Thomas's faces, they began to realize that their lives were about to change forever. Sarah, her heart overflowing with joy, knelt down to the children's level. "You're free now," she said softly. "You don't have to worry anymore. You're safe, and you have a family now." The children stared at her in disbelief. For so long they had been abandoned, lost in the world with no hope of a better life. They had learned not to trust anyone, not to believe in promises. But now something was different. There was a warmth in Sarah's voice, a gentleness in Thomas's eyes that made them believe. They had been rescued. John, the oldest, was the first to speak. "Are you serious?" "We're really free." Sarah smiled and nodded. "Yes, we've come to take you home with us." The words home and family seemed so foreign to the children. They had never experienced those things before. Their lives had been filled with hardship and uncertainty, and the idea of being part of a real family felt almost impossible. But the more they looked at Sarah and Thomas, the more they began to believe that this could be real. The children stood up, their movements tentative at first, unsure of what to do. But as Sarah and Thomas led them out of the barn, they felt a sense of hope that they hadn't felt in years. The barn, which had been a place of despair and fear, now seemed like a distant memory. The walk to Sarah and Thomas's home was filled with a sense of wonder. The children had never seen a place so beautiful and welcoming. The house stood at the edge of the village, nestled among tall trees and surrounded by lush gardens. It was everything the orphans had never had, a safe, comfortable home filled with warmth and love. As they walked through the gate and up to the front door, the children couldn't help but look around in awe. The house was big, but not in a cold, intimidating way. It was filled with life, with flowers blooming in the garden and birds singing in the trees. There was a swing set in the yard, and the smell of freshly baked bread wafted from the open window. It was the kind of place that made the children feel like they had finally found a place where they belonged. When they stepped inside, they were greeted by a cozy living room with a warm fire crackling in the fireplace. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with stories, and there were comfortable couches and chairs scattered around the room. It was a stark contrast to the cold, barren barn they had left behind. The air was filled with the scent of fresh flowers and the sweet smell of homemade meals. Sarah led them into the kitchen, where a large pot of soup was simmering on the stove. The table was set with plates, glasses, and a bowl of freshly cut fruit. It was the kind of meal that made the children's stomachs growl with hunger. They hadn't eaten properly in days, and the thought of a warm, delicious meal made their hearts swell with gratitude. As they sat down at the table, Sarah smiled at them. "We're going to take good care of you," she said. "You'll have food, a warm bed, and most importantly, you'll have a family who loves you." The children exchanged shy glances, still unsure of how to react. For so long they had been taught not to trust others, especially adults. But Sarah's words were genuine, and the kindness in her eyes made them believe. They began to eat slowly at first, as if unsure whether they deserved such a meal. But with each bite they began to relax, and a sense of peace began to settle over them. They had been given more than just food. They had been given something they had never known before, a sense of belonging. After dinner, Sarah and Thomas showed the children to their new rooms. The house had enough space for each of them to have their own bed, a place they could call their own. Emma, the youngest, was especially excited about her room. It had a soft, colorful bedspread and a small window that looked out over the garden. For the first time in her life, she had a space that was just for her, a place where she could feel safe and loved. The older children, John, Anna, and the twins, Luke and Lily, were equally amazed by their new rooms. Each one was decorated with care, filled with books, toys, and other things that made the children feel like they were no longer just surviving, they were living. They could hardly believe that this was their new reality. They were no longer orphans. They were part of a family. As they settled into their new room, Sarah and Thomas sat down in the living room, reflecting on the journey they had just taken. They had worked so hard to get to this point, and now that the children were safe, they could finally breathe a sigh of relief. But Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. Their work was far from over. The days that followed were filled with routines that the children had never known. They woke up to the smell of fresh coffee brewing, and the sound of laughter filled the house as they ate breakfast together. Sarah and Thomas made sure that each child felt heard, loved, and cared for. They enrolled the children in school, and for the first time the children experienced the joy of learning. They made friends, played games, and learned about the world outside the small barn they had once called home. It wasn't always easy. The children had a lot to adjust to, and there were moments when they struggled with trust and fear. But Sarah and Thomas never gave up on them. They patiently helped them work through their fears, always showing kindness and understanding. As the weeks passed, the orphans began to flourish. They grew stronger, both physically and emotionally. Their once dull eyes began to shine with hope, and their laughter filled the house. They no longer saw themselves as abandoned or forgotten. They were part of something much bigger now, a family that would always stand by them no matter what. For Sarah and Thomas, the change was just as profound. They had always wanted to be parents, and now, with these 5 children in their lives, they had become the family they had dreamed of. Their house, which had once felt empty, was now full of love and life. It was a home in every sense of the word. One evening, as they all sat around the dinner table, Sarah looked at the children and smiled. "I want you all to know how much we love you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You're not just here because we saved you. You're here because you are a part of our family now, and nothing will ever change that." The children looked around at each other, their faces filled with happiness and gratitude. For the first time in their lives, they truly understood what it meant to be loved. They had come from a place of darkness, but now they were living in the light of a new, beautiful life. And in that moment, they knew that no matter what the future held, they would always have each other, and the family who had changed their lives forever. Months passed, and the once quiet home that Sarah and Thomas had lived in now buzzed with life. The laughter of the children, the sounds of their footsteps running through the halls, and the chatter over meals filled the air with warmth. It was everything Sarah and Thomas had ever dreamed of. A family, one they had fought so hard to create, one they could finally call their own. The children were flourishing in ways that Sarah and Thomas had never expected. Emma, the youngest, was now more playful than ever. She spent her days running through the garden, picking flowers and asking Sarah 1,000 questions about the world. "Why does the sky turn orange at night?" she would ask, her eyes wide with curiosity. "How do birds know where to go in the winter?" Sarah loved answering her questions, and with each new answer, Emma seemed to grow even more excited about the world around her. John, the oldest, had taken on a new sense of responsibility. At first, he had felt like he needed to protect his siblings, to be the strong one in the family. But now he was beginning to realize that he didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone anymore. He began to open up, allowing himself to be just a teenager. He spent time helping Thomas in the garden, fixing things around the house, and even helping Emma with her schoolwork. He was learning what it meant to be part of a team, to be cared for and loved in return. Anna, the second oldest, had always been more quiet and reserved. She had carried the weight of the loss of her parents for so long that she struggled to express herself. But in this new home, with Sarah and Thomas's gentle encouragement, Anna began to find her voice. She started drawing, something she had never felt comfortable doing before. The walls of her room were now filled with sketches of trees, animals, and the stars in the night sky. It was her way of processing all that had happened, her way of understanding the beauty of her new life. The twins, Luke and Lily, had been inseparable since birth. They had always been the most energetic of the group, constantly playing games and making up their own little adventures. In their new home, they discovered a world of new things to explore. They loved helping Sarah bake cookies and running around the yard with their new dog, who had become their best friend. They were no longer worried about where their next meal would come from, or whether they would have to sleep on the cold, hard floor. They had each other, and now they had a family that cared for them. Every day was an adventure. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of frustration, of confusion, and of growing pains. The children had scars from their past, scars that couldn't be erased overnight. Sometimes they would wake up in the middle of the night, crying out from a bad dream, or would have moments of sudden silence as if remembering the hardships they had faced. But Sarah and Thomas were always there to comfort them, to remind them that they were safe now, that they were loved. Sarah spent hours reading to them every evening, telling them stories of far-off places and exciting adventures. At first, the children had been unsure of the stories, unsure of their place in them. But slowly, they began to get lost in the tales. They began to see themselves as the heroes of their own stories, people who had survived, people who had triumphed over their past. The more they listened, the more they started to believe that their future could be just as bright as the ones in the stories. The family spent weekends exploring nearby parks and forests, hiking up hills and having picnics by the river. These outings were something the children had never experienced before. They had never been able to simply enjoy nature, to breathe in the fresh air without fear. Now they were free to run, to play, to explore, all without worry. As the seasons changed, so did their lives. The house, once quiet and empty, was now filled with memories. The children's laughter echoed through every room. The pictures on the walls were full of happy moments. The first day of school photos, the family picnics, birthdays celebrated with cakes and gifts. The children had become a part of Sarah and Thomas's life in ways they could never have imagined. One cold winter evening, as the snow gently fell outside, Sarah and Thomas sat by the fire, reflecting on how far they had come. The children were all asleep, tucked into their warm beds, their faces peaceful in the glow of the nightlight. Thomas looked over at Sarah, his heart full of love. "I can't believe how much has changed," he said softly. "It feels like a dream." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "It is a dream," she whispered. "But it's our dream, and we made it come true." They sat in silence for a while, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. Both of them had spent so many years longing for a family, for the joy of raising children. They had never expected their family to come to them in such an unexpected way, but now that it had, they couldn't imagine life any other way. They had taken a chance. They had risked everything to save the children, and now they were reaping the rewards of that decision. The love they had poured into their new family had blossomed in ways they could never have anticipated. They had given these children a future, a chance to grow and thrive, but in return, they had been given something even more valuable, the love and joy of having a family to call their own. As the fire burned low, Sarah and Thomas rose from their seats and went to check on the children. They stood for a moment in the doorway of each room, watching as their little ones slept soundly. John's face was relaxed in sleep, a faint smile on his lips. Anna's drawings lay beside her bed, and Luke and Lily had their arms wrapped around their dog. Their favorite stuffed animals nestled beside them. For the first time, Sarah and Thomas truly understood the power of love. They had saved the children, yes, but the children had also saved them. Their lives had become richer and fuller because of the bond they had formed. They were no longer two lonely people yearning for a family. They had a family now, a family of their own. Over the next few years, the family grew even closer. The children flourished in school and became more confident in themselves. They found their passions. Anna continued to draw, John became interested in carpentry, and the twins loved to help Sarah in the garden. Emma, always curious, started reading books about animals, learning everything she could about the world around her. On Sarah and Thomas's anniversary, the children surprised them with a special gift, a scrapbook filled with pictures, memories, and heartfelt letters. It was their way of showing their gratitude for everything that Sarah and Thomas had done for them. The letters were full of love, and the pictures captured moments of happiness, laughter, and adventure. As Sarah flipped through the pages, tears filled her eyes. She had never imagined that this would be her life. She had dreamed of being a mother, of having a family to love and care for, but she had never expected that it would come in the form of these 5 amazing children. They had changed her life, just as much as she had changed theirs. The family stood together in the living room, smiling, hugging, and laughing. They were a family in every sense of the word, bound by love, trust, and the knowledge that they would always have each other. No matter where life took them, they would face it together. And as they sat together, surrounded by love, Sarah and Thomas realized that the true meaning of family wasn't just about blood or shared history. It was about the bonds that were created through love, sacrifice, and the willingness to give everything for those you care about. In the end, family was about choosing each other every single day. The journey that had started with a desperate search for hope had turned into something more beautiful than Sarah and Thomas could have ever imagined. And as they looked at their children, each one unique, each one special, they knew that their story had only just begun. Together they would face whatever came next, united as one.